the conclusion of our series, Habits of the Household. These past 5 weeks, we've been exploring the normal parts of our days and the ways that we can create different habits and routines that bring peace and fullness to our life, especially during this time of the year when it seems like a lot of things are rushed and busy and chaotic, to incorporate habits that can help us feel calm in the midst of that. So we've talked about habits for waking up. We've talked about habits for different meal times. We've talked about habits for work. Last week, we talked about habits for play. And today, as you just heard with the kids, we're talking about habits for nighttime or for sleep. Now, there are a few authors who have influenced me throughout this study, and one of them is Jonathan Whitman Early, who writes about a night when his youngest son, who was 1 year old at the time, woke him up at 1 a.m. crying. Jonathan was frustrated when he got out of bed to tend to him because he had just gotten back from a work trip, and he was thinking about how this week would be the week where he could catch up on sleep, and obviously that wasn't happening. He was both physically and soul tired, he said, and he hoped that he'd just be able to pick his son up to kind of shush him, back to sleep and lay him back down. But as soon as he picked him up, he said the boy's body went stiff, and he tried to wiggle out of his arms, and Jonathan raised his voice and said, "No, not now, no." And when he heard the futility in his voice, and he said he felt kind of stupid also saying this, he put his child down and said, "Fine, just cry then." And he stormed out of the room. Now, some of you, myself included, might be able to resonate with that story. Whether we are awoken in the night by children or not, our sleep, or lack thereof, can have a huge effect on how we interact with others and how we live our life. Now, of course, there's been many studies on this, on the science of sleep and its effect on people. You may have heard some of those. Some of the most recent ones report that nearly 30% of adults who should be getting about 7 to 8 hours of sleep a night average less than 6 hours of sleep a night. That same study said that 30% of high school students who need around 10 hours of sleep, I don't think I ever got that as a high school student, reported getting at least 8 hours of sleep on an average school night. And there was another study that found that over 7% of people between 25 to 35 years of age admitted to nodding off while driving, which is a little bit scary. Now, we've heard most of these statistics before, right? And nothing really changes when we hear them. We just yawn and drink more coffee, right? Because that's how we do things. And I think all of this could speak to something that's a lot deeper. But before we get there, I want us to turn to a story from the gospel today, from the Gospel of Mark, where I think we see how much God cares about sleep. Because if God didn't care about sleep, Jesus, in this story, wouldn't be conked out in the back of a boat in the middle of a storm. So I invite you to listen, and you can follow along on the screen. On that day, when evening had come, he said to them, "Let us go across to the other side." And leaving the crowd behind, they took him with them in the boat just as he was. Other boats were with him. A great windstorm arose, and the waves beat into the boat so that the boat was already being swamped. But he was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him up and said, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" And waking up, he rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Be silent, be still." Then the wind ceased, and there was a dead calm. He said to them, "Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great fear and said to one another, "Who is this that even the wind and the sea obey him?" And I wonder if you were surprised by a couple of things in this story. To find that Jesus is asleep in the middle of a storm. But I was also surprised, too, that instead of waking Jesus to simply ask for help, They woke him up saying, "Teacher, don't you care about all of this that is happening? We're dying here on the boat," right? And then, after calming the storm, Jesus says, "Why were you afraid? Don't you have faith?" And it's interesting that Jesus makes this connection between fear and lack of faith, because faith really is all about trust. For example, you would only trust someone, you would have to trust someone in order to let them watch your pet or to watch your child when you're away, right? You have faith in that person, you trust them. But when we are afraid, we can have a really hard time in trusting others. Fear can paralyze us. And so the disciples are understandably afraid in a storm where it seems as if their boat is going to sink, and they allow fear to overtake them to the point where they assume the worst in Jesus because he is sleeping away. Now, some of you might feel the same way about a spouse if they are someone who's able to sleep peacefully and fall asleep quickly, and you are not. I am the not spouse, and my spouse is the one who can. And that might have been the same kind of frustration going on here, right? You're just sleeping away peacefully without a care in the world. But here's the thing to remember. Jesus calms the sea, and their fear doesn't necessarily evaporate, but it's transformed into something that made them assume the worst, into wholly awe at the power of Jesus in their midst. Now, very quickly, I'd also like to point out the context in which Mark was written. It's always important to look at what's going on the time whenever scriptures were written. And this was right around the time of the destruction of the temple, around 70 CE. And this was a monumental storm for the life of people who are reading Mark's words when he writes them. Their center of worship, really of their whole community life, had just been destroyed. There were identities among Jewish Christians and other Jewish groups that were all at play. There were Gentiles as well that were coming to know Jesus, and everyone was really trying to figure all of that out, what everything means. The world as they knew it was ending, really. Chaos was all around, and it was a really dark and difficult time. And then they read this story in which Jesus is not some therapist, and Jesus is not some miracle worker, but Jesus is an ordinary person who needs a good nap, just like you and me. And yet still is a revelation of God's extraordinary power and purpose, because Jesus is able to calm the turmoil in their hearts and bring them together after all of this destruction in their life. So what does any of that have to do with sleep, right? Well, I really believe that our lack of sleep or our lack of rest in general is a result of a culture that has become very disordered and chaotic. And our sleep habits, I think they can tell us a lot of things, but there's 3 things that I want to talk about. Our sleep habits can profess our loves, profess what we love. They can profess what we trust, and they can also profess our limits. So let's walk through this a bit in light of this story, Jesus asleep during a storm and then calming the storm. So first, our sleep habits profess our loves. If we love something a lot, then we're willing to give up sleep for it. This is true for parents who will lose sleep over taking care of their children, trying to get them to sleep, right? It happens when we have late night conversations with people that we care about, people that we might catch up with on the phone or meet late at night. And those are things that aren't very harmless, right? Good things that we should be doing. But we also might stay up late thinking about our work. We might think, I just have one more email to send or one more message that we have to write and get out. And we think about how that work, that little bit of work, will make our lives easier in the morning, when sometimes it doesn't always end up being a little bit of work, right? We might also give up our sleep for me time. A lot of times, the day is so demanding of us and our attention that finally, at the end of the day, when there's no one who needs our attention, we want to then focus on something for us, right? A nighttime drink or a TV show that we want to be able to stream, or maybe a scroll through social media, right? To just block everything out and all the other demands of the day. Before they were on the boat together, Jesus was preaching to a large crowd. And so we can imagine that Jesus had just had a day where he was very needed, where he was giving a lot of his attention to other people and everyone was paying attention to him. And so he could have, when they got on the boat with his disciples, said, let's have a debrief of all that we've done today, or taken more time to talk to them and to share with them. But instead, he knew that he needed to prioritize sleep. You see, when our sleep is disordered, it shows us our disordered love as well, and the way that we make idols of entertainment and even idols of productivity. It becomes a problem when it comes at the cost of our health or our sleep. Now, the second thing that sleep habits profess is our trusts. So often, those middle of the night hours can be a perfect time for us to be awake with all the problems in our lives and our inability to solve them. Now, this can sometimes be heightened by social media, which often can produce a lot of the worries in our mind. And if you're not one to fall asleep quickly, like me, it might be because of that revolving to-do list that's in your mind that just cannot turn off and cannot sleep because of all that there is to get done in your life, right? And when this happens, we might feel a little bit like the disciples crying out in the storm, God, why aren't you working here in my life? Why aren't you helping me to fall asleep? Why are all these problems on my shoulders? And as someone who knows what it's like to lie awake with all those worries, I also know that what we trust tells us where our hearts lie. What we trust tells us where our hearts lie. So do we trust fear and let it keep us up in the middle of the night? Or do we trust that God will take care of things even while we sleep at night? Do we choose to hear Jesus calming the storms in our own lives? The third thing that sleep habits profess is our limits. And this is a big one, because sleep exposes our reality that we are frail and weak people. We need sleep because we are finite human beings. My husband is someone who can function better than me on a little amount of sleep. I need to sleep in order to be a kind person. Anyone there with me? If I don't get enough sleep, I'm usually not very kind, right? Some of the most challenging days of our marriage were when we had a newborn in the home, 2 different times having a newborn in the home. And there was one morning in this postpartum time in which I was particularly frustrated and I snapped at Richie. I don't even remember what it was about. And soon after that, I apologized, saying that I was just really exhausted. And my husband very meekly and plainly said, in the middle of the night, you're not very kind either. I have learned the limits of my sleep, right? But the thing is, our culture pushes back on these limits. Every week when I'm preparing my sermon, I try to match some of the slides on the screen. So the slides you see during my sermon are usually chosen by me through this program called Canva. And Canva will find an image or a graphic that goes along with something if you type it in the search engine. So I just typed in the search engine limit or limits. And it was very difficult to find an image for limit. Around this image were things that said, we are limitless. Go past your limits. Just keep pushing, thinking that we're limitless people and that our limits shouldn't define us. And it's all around us, in our culture, drive-throughs that stay open late so you can eat great, even late. I think that's a commercial. And there are 24 stores that are open 24 hours, right? Telling us that we don't need to limit everything. We can shop in the middle of the night if we need to. And then to even push that over the edge, while we're shopping in the middle of the night at that store that's open 24 hours, in the checkout line, we'll see these little bottles that say 5-hour energy on them to tell us, you have no limits, just drink this and you can just stay up and be fine. You can continue to live without limits, we're told, but to the detriment of our health. And when we give into that kind of culture, we're really saying that our bodies don't matter and that our sleep is one more barrier or limit that is an obstacle to us to achieving what we want. But here's what happens when we yield. Another author that I read during this series is Tish Warren, and this is what she says. Each night, when we yield to sleep, we practice letting go of our reliance on self-effort. And not only confession of our limits, it's also a joyful confession of God's limitless care for us. As Christians, the act of ceasing and relaxing into sleep is an act of reliance on God. You see, when we rest and when we prioritize sleep, we stop relying on our own efforts and we lean into God for sufficiency. And that totally changes the game. When Jonathan's son was having this fit in the middle of the night, and he decided to leave him alone in his anger, he realized that he was trying to use his anger through his lack of sleep to control his son instead of using his love to console his son. And he got back up after realizing this, and he went to his son's room, he picked him up, he held him very gently, and in a matter of minutes, his son fell back asleep. And that's what Jesus does with his disciples here when he told the storm to be still. And that's exactly what Jesus does in the chaos of our own lives that keeps us from calming down at night. We all need that reminder at the end of the day when we're exhausted and we're running on reserves. Now, I know that sometimes we might need a little help from our doctors and other medical professionals to help us sleep, to help us ease our anxiety, and that is all good gifts that God gives us. I'm also aware, as someone whose husband woke up at 1:30 this morning to get to his 3 a.m. shift at the hospital that he's working at right now, that not all of us have a life that gives us the opportunity to sleep good and well all of the time. But there are some basic habits that I think we can try to incorporate at the end of our day, whatever that means for us, that can help us lean into this. So the insert in your bulletin that I referenced during the children's sermon, I invite you to keep that handy. And every week I've given you habits on these inserts just for you to try to see what it might be like to incorporate them in your life. So the first habit that I encourage you to have is to not underestimate the power of enough sleep. If it's possible this week, I encourage you to try to go to bed on time and to wake up on time and to see how that might affect your all areas of your life, okay? And the second habit I encourage you to have is to rest in God beyond just sleep. In this culture, we're told to be limitless, right? To achieve no matter what the cost is. And that also leads us to feeling very restless. Sometimes a community of faith and other close friends who we can rest with or unplug with is the way that we really can find rest and peace for our souls when we take time to do that. And lastly, I encourage you to practice a nightly blessing like this one, like I did with the kids. Perhaps there are other prayers or blessings that you have at night, and those are great as well. But the point is to reframe your mind and to find that calm and quiet center where we can really focus on the blessings that Jesus gives us and asking God to guide us as we sleep and to take care of things while we sleep. So our Methodist history of our church includes a movement known as a circuit riding movement. There were circuit riders who were pastors who would travel from church to church as Methodism was rising and becoming more popular across our country. There were many churches that were popping up in homes and in places, and there weren't enough pastors for them. So these pastors on horseback would travel from church to church, and they wouldn't get everywhere in 1 week, right? A lot of times the services were led by the laity, but once a month or every other week, a pastor would be there to preach, to give sacraments for this church, right? Now, these circuit riders worked between 90 to 100 hours a week because of the distance between church and church and the amount of times that they had to preach and to lead. 90 to 100 hours of work a week. And many of them would collapse from burnout, literally collapse. And I just learned this week. This wasn't in my United Methodist history class in seminary. To try to combat this, to alleviate this, do you know what they did? They created a worn-out ministers fund. Doesn't that sound ridiculous? They created a worn-out ministers fund. So instead of just reframing their tactics or trying to figure out a situation that wouldn't overwork these circuit riders, they created a fund, which meant another cause to lose sleep around, right? And to rally around to try to encourage these pastors as if money would help them have a better work life. But these worn-out ministers are part of our heritage. Many of them are the heroes of the church that we lift up, right? And so many of us, I think, are continuing that legacy. I don't just mean pastors, I mean all of us are continuing that legacy by being worn out parents or worn out business people or worn out followers of Jesus. And Jesus is saying, be silent, be still. And we also hear several times throughout the gospel that phrase, do not be afraid. God doesn't want any of that for us. We don't have to carry the weight of the world on our shoulders. We can lean in to God's abundance and lean in to God's rest. And I pray that would be so for each and every one of us.